So I've kind of been lying to you and to myself. I am not the person I thought I was for the first 27 years of my life. Let's talk about it. Like most people, from the moment I was born, I started to be put in boxes. The first box that I was put in was boy because of my physical characteristics. And as I got older, that box defined me in a lot of ways, and other boxes and labels started to appear. The label of boy defined me because it influenced some of the ways that I spent my time and the people I spent my time with. The label of athlete defined me because I played basketball as my main sport. There were lots of other labels placed on me throughout my life, but what I found is that labels are a convenient way for other people to perceive and understand who you are, and for you to make sense of the human being that you are as well. Even now, labels are easy and they help me make sense of the person that I am. When I think parent or content creator or runner, I know exactly what activity I do, what I like to do, and it's an easy way to describe myself to other people. Labels, boxes, they can be great because they help us make sense of the world and just help us understand each other when we're totally unique beings that would be completely incomprehensible to each other if we were able to know everything about each other. But there are some cases where the labels break down. Break for bubbly. Like in my case, most of the labels I've worn throughout my life have felt right. Athlete has felt right. Runner has felt right. Parent has been one of the best labels I've ever received. But there's one label that never quite fit, and I never realized why until now. So let's jump back to the moment I was born. Because of my physical characteristics, the doctor labeled me a boy, and I lived most of my life taking that label. But the problem is there were certain things that just didn't quite add up. Like, sure, I was a boy, I loved sports, I loved stereotypical boy toys like Star Wars and Bionicles. I played with Pirates of the Caribbean and pretended that I was a pirate. But then there were the toys that didn't make sense for a boy. We used to go to Walt Disney World all the time as a family, and in downtown Disney, there was this station where you could build your own box of toy parts to bring home. On one side for the boys was Mr. Potato Head, and on the other side for the girls was My Little Pony. You'd get this cardboard box and you would fill it up as much as you could with accessories, pieces, figures, whatever you wanted to put in. And I couldn't choose. I ended up getting one box on each side, Mr. Potato Head and My Little Pony. That wasn't the only example where I didn't act like you'd expect a boy to act. I loved Pirates of the Caribbean, but that also meant that I loved to play dress up and wear costume jewelry. I remember I had this one skull ring with shiny studs on it that I wore until it broke. So there were these little parts of my life, these little cracks in the label of boy that just didn't quite add up. But because I was homeschooled and I had parents who let me explore and be free, I didn't realize how incongruent those things were. Not much changed when I was in college, but I did start to understand my place in the world a little bit more. Coming from a homeschooled background, I was around people my age in much larger quantities than I ever had been before, which just helped me to see where I fit in and where I didn't fit. And actually, as part of my college experience, for 3 years, I lived in this apartment that was probably 6 bedrooms where we crammed in 10 or 11 people, and they were all men. We called it the mansion. And being in a very hyper-masculine environment, I started to feel like I didn't quite fit, but I didn't quite know why. It was like there were just some times with the way men acted that I felt a little bit like an outsider, a little bit like I was not totally part of the group, but I couldn't put a finger on it. So I went to college, I got a business degree, and I moved from Philadelphia on the East Coast out to New Mexico with my wife, who was in med school at the time. And 3 things happened in quick succession that really started to change my perspective on myself, my life, and just how I thought about my identity. So first, back in 2019, when I moved out to New Mexico, I got my first real adult job. I worked at a company where we delivered essentially news briefings that were 2 to 3 pages of all the top stories from the past day, summarized and compiled to be super easy to read to executives at big companies first thing in the morning. So I had to have my 8 hours of work completed by the time those executives on the East Coast were waking up and logging on, which meant I was working overnight. And then not even a year after I moved out to New Mexico, the COVID-19 pandemic hit and the world completely shut down. And lastly, just being in New Mexico physically, I was away from pretty much all of my friends and family, and especially during the pandemic when we couldn't really travel, it highlighted the isolation of being away from the people that I cared about. And so all three of those things meant I had a lot of time with just myself. When it's 3 a.m. and I'm sitting there just about finished up with my briefing, nothing else to do, it's just me and my thoughts in a way that I've never really experienced before. But there was also the internet and social media, and like just wanting to have an online presence doing this, what I'm doing now, meant I was spending a good amount of time online. And so somehow or another, I started to come across people who didn't fit into the typical gender binary on my social media feeds. People who are transgender, people who are non-binary, people who are agender, people who just didn't fit the typical label of man and woman. This whole world that I just never knew existed because I'd always lived in these kind of silos. And at first, I didn't think much of it, but as time went on and as I heard people talk about their experiences, it was a little bit scary how closely some of it resonated with the ways I had felt. Because I guess I always just assumed like being transgender was just something you knew and something that was innate from the moment you could conceive of it, which definitely wasn't the case for me. That idea finally transformed into realizing that I might just not be a man at all. The idea that I was just a man who liked feminine things shattered. And there were other factors to it too. It wasn't just like this overnight epiphany. I also started growing my hair out because that was something I had always wanted to do. Pandemic was a perfect opportunity to do that. If I was working overnight and never leaving the house, nobody would see me. I started painting my nails because, again, that's something I had always wanted to do. My mom actually told me that she used to paint my nails because I would ask her to before I can even remember when I was a kid. It was something about the pandemic and just like the fact that we would go to the grocery store fully covered and wipe down our groceries before we brought them in the house. The fact that that was all normal meant that trying little experiments with my appearance totally felt reasonable in a way that it would not have a few years before. And so through all of those experiments and the online content about gender that I was being exposed to, I started to become more comfortable with the idea that something might be going on and I might not just be, again, a man who has feminine interests. So I started to read more. I picked up some books about what it means to be like gender, non-conforming, transgender, and more of it resonated with me. The more stories I read about people who didn't have this big epiphany, who just had these kind of little feelings of things not being right, these small incongruencies with certain labels that they grew up with, that they were used to, that were placed on them, the more I started to realize how much those stories resonated with me and be okay with exploring new identities. Because at first, the idea itself was terrifying. Like the fact that people who were gender non-conforming were talking about experiences that were like my own when I thought I knew who I was, I thought I knew what my identity was, that was terrifying. The prospect of like having to go down that path of figuring out who I was and having no idea where it was going to lead, that was terrifying. But I couldn't ignore the feelings anymore because now other people had put them into words, which in a sense validated them for me, but also made me think more about what my actual experience and identity might be. Fast forward a few years. I'm 27 years old. I've been working corporate jobs for 5 years now. And all of those things that I started exploring a couple years ago have finally made sense. I finally got rid of all the doubts and insecurity that came with figuring out my identity and felt comfortable putting a new label on myself. I came out first to my wife, who was very supportive, even though I was nervous to tell her, and to my parents, who were also thankfully very supportive, as well as the rest of my immediate family. So now I'm here. I just turned 28 years old in December. It's 2025 and the calendar year has just started. So in more ways than one, it's a new, fresh beginning. But unlike all of the other new years that I've gone through before, all of the resolutions I've set, the ones I've kept, the ones I've failed at, this year feels a little bit different. Because this is the first year where I'm approaching it with just an opportunity to finally be my authentic self. So at 28, this is crazy to say and feels like such a big change from where I've been before. But looking back, it just makes so much sense. Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. And this is the new me. Being open and authentic about my identity, not having this jumble of confusion inside me at all times, and finally finding a label that feels right. All of these years, I've been in a box that didn't quite contain me, that didn't quite make sense. And now I'm free of that label, I'm free of that box, and it feels like a weight has lifted. And I'm so thankful that the people I care about the most accept me for it. So if you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.